Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. We are thrilled to be here to talk about burnout. It's an issue that has plagued the nonprofit sector since long before the pandemic. I personally know that it's something that I have dealt with in many uh, times within my professional career. And now that we are entering this sort of, as the WHO would say, the post pandemic life, we are looking towards a year that's going to be a really bleak economic outlook for a lot of nonprofits. So, normal stressors that fundraisers, executive directors, and boards have been facing on a daily basis are going to continue to mount as organizations are continuing to find ways to stay afloat. And it's inevitable that a lot of folks that are not yet burned out soon will be. Some sector numbers, Nonprofit Quarterly reported that 30% of nonprofit workers are burned out, with an additional 20% in danger of burning out. It's almost half of the workforce in the nonprofit sector. In 2022, the Chronicle of Philanthropy surveyed over 650 fundraisers, and it found that 94% said they strongly agreed or somewhat agreed that there is tremendous pressure to succeed, which we know is a has direct correlation to causing burnout within employees as well. Additionally, 82% of fundraisers reported that they felt like their roles were underappreciated. A lot of factors that are going to contribute towards this really sector wide sort of issue of burnout. So today I am honored to be joined by Pat Duboise and Ike Ubasineke, who are here with me today so that we can discuss the implications of burnout, how we can manage it better, both individually and organization wide. Um, Throughout this webinar today, I would invite you to please feel free to drop comments throughout. And as you think of questions that you may have, we'll do questions at the end, but please go ahead and drop them in the comments as you have them to remember them. And then at the end, we will do audience questions, but please feel free to participate throughout. Would love to have your input and experiences and any advice that you may have for the group as well as we're talking. So let me quickly introduce our guests who are joining us today. Pat Duboise has more than 25 years of grant experience. From 2003 to 2022, she secured and managed an annual portfolio of more than $8 million in government, foundation, and corporate grants for Mercy Care, a federally qualified health center. During this time, she also worked as a freelance grant writer for various nonprofits and educational institutions, while also conducting grant reviews for Health Resources and Service Administration, United Way for Greater Atlanta, and the Georgia Department of Education. She is currently serving as the grants manager with the Atlanta-based Policing Alternatives and Diversion Initiative, and as a subcontractor with Grant Scribes and Boyd Grants. She is an active member of the Grant Professionals Association and GPA's Georgia chapter. And in 2021, she co-authored the article, Bigger Than Burnout, Strategies for Winning the Silent Battle. And she is going to be sharing several great takeaways from that with us today. Ike Ubasineke has more than 15 years of experience in leadership development in both for-profit and nonprofit spaces. He's coached over 400 leaders, led a 200-member leadership team, and has served as director of leader development and recruiting for a company with over 1,000 team members. He currently runs a leadership coaching business called Grow or Die, with the mission of helping hundreds of thousands of leaders to help build healthy and sustainable habits and routines by 2032. On this mission, he quickly realized that one of the biggest obstacles to achieving that goal is burnout. So Ike has created resources like the Burnout Assessment to help leaders uncover key themes in their lives that may lead to burnout so that they can work towards eliminating it completely. So thank you both so much for joining us, and let's jump right in. Tell me about a time when you personally were burned out, and how did you know? Pat, let's start with you, and then Ike. And audience members, please feel free to share your own experiences in the comments.
Okay, sure. Thank you, Susannah. I guess my first experience with burnout was 2017. And I became burnt out with the profession, with the grants profession. I had gone to one of our annual grants conferences, and I just came away with, it was all right. Afterwards, everybody else was raving about it, and I'm like, okay, there's some kind of disconnect here. And so, but the interesting part is that I really didn't know what it was. I just knew there was something off, and I needed to find a way to re-engage, reconnect, and that's when I became more involved with the chapter and with the mentoring program and that sort of thing. And then I guess my next episode with burnout was probably in 2021, when I became honestly burnt out with the organization, with the job that I was at, and just realized that it was time for me to make a change and move on. And so I was able to do that. Just, the typical symptoms of sort of cynicism, distrust, feeling inadequate, all of those things. And by that time, I knew what it was, and I knew what steps I needed to take to move forward.
Ike.
Yeah, for me, it's really interesting. This was actually in 2012, around 2011, 2012, when I was experiencing this, not knowing what it was, but I was working for a parachurch ministry, and I was working a lot. Typically how that works, right? You're working all the time. And something I realized is that there was no off. I just kept going and going and going. And even when I was off work, my mind was continually going nonstop. And I just couldn't stop working. And I think it was interesting for me because I wouldn't have titled it burnout because I was enjoying a lot of what I was doing, but I didn't have the energy really to, get through things. I think the biggest indicator for me is a lot of the healthy habits that I had started to suffer. And people around me started to see, like, you're not the same person that you were when we met you multiple years ago. And so I think that experience of nonstop activity and working all the time, even in work that I enjoyed, really showed me that I was in a place where I was out.
Yeah. And I think that these are all through lines, right? I think this is all symptoms and things that we probably can all relate to, that we have experienced at some point. I know when I was serving as an executive director, the moment that I knew it was time for me to step down from that role was because I had hit a point where I was so burned out that I felt incredibly apathetic, exhausted, and I wasn't doing the work that the organization needed in their leadership at that point. So I absolutely, everything that you all just shared really resonates. So thanks for sharing that. And I would imagine too, as audience members, as you all are thinking about this, I think sometimes we don't always recognize immediately when it's the difference between just having a really busy deadline season and that you're working towards something versus when you recognize that it is part of that longer term ongoing sort of pattern. So hopefully today some of the strategies we'll be able to share are going to be helpful. And again, please let us know as you have any questions or input throughout. So Pat, would love to start. I love the framework of the I care, we care, they care framework that your research team laid out in the article that sort of breaks it down into those three layers of a personal level, a kind of smaller team group level, and then the overall culture of a workplace. Mm-hmm. And I'm curious, as you have seen that, as your group was conducting the research and surveys for this study, can you talk a little bit about what you found in terms of the chicken and egg of, did there need to be a culture of caring created in order to allow individuals to address their burnout? Or did you find that it was actually more individual agency and in really taking charge of their burnout that and managing up for that led to a larger cultural shift? Do you mind speaking to that?
Sure. If you'll give me a moment just to recognize my colleagues, the Healthy Grant Pro team. So Jonna Rogers, Bethany Planton, and Trish Bachman. And they were the original group that came together to do this study in, I believe, late 2019, 2020. And then I joined the group in 2021. And so again, our research has been focused strictly on grant professionals, because we're all members of GPA, Grant Professional Association. And so with our work, we have really focused on individuals, and looking again at the eye care, which is obviously individual focused. We care in terms of, who in our community can we find to help us in addressing burnout. And then with the they care, it's really, we the strategies that we feel that organizations can put in place to sort of create what we would call an anti-burnout environment. But even in developing those strategies, they're really presented as sort of a way to manage up, and things to suggest that individuals take to their leadership to help them move forward. One of the things that we're doing as we move into this next phase of research is looking more at the workplace and getting feedback both from grant professionals and the individuals who supervise them. So we can really get more of an understanding of the workplace. But back to your beginning question, yes, it really has been more of sort of individual focus, individual agency in terms of addressing burnout. So there's room, obviously, to take a look at it from the other side. And that's what we're hoping to do with this next step.
Fantastic. Can you speak to any of the strategies that you all recommended for someone experiencing burnout in terms of how they communicate that to their leadership team? And if you have any suggestions on at what point does that feel like the appropriate time to do so?
I think, if you're dealing with burnout, I think you definitely want to take the opportunity to talk to leadership. One way to put it is, you want to talk to them before they talk to you. And come to them. Well, a couple things. Don't assume that they're unaware. Don't assume that you're alone. They may be suffering as well with their own issues. This could be a good time to address all of that. I think another good thing to do is come with options, not just complaints, if you will. And I'm not trying to trivialize it by saying that, but just, come to it with, okay, this is what I'm dealing with. This is what I've thought about in terms of how to address it. I think that gives you an opportunity. I just think that may be better received. It also gives you an opportunity, I think, to really get sort of the lay of the land and figure out, am I in a position where I'm dealing with people who are receptive and who want to help? Or, the converse to that, is this maybe not a good situation? And then I think from there, you then know what you need to think about and what you need to take forward. But I do think it's worth at least having that initial conversation.
Fantastic. Thank you. So I love that you mentioned that if you are experiencing burnout within your role, it also certainly that there may be situations where it just may not be a good situation, but also that there may be a scenario in which your manager is also experiencing that as well. There was a tweet a couple of years ago that really resonated as I was thinking about sort of questions for this talk, from Andrew Wilkinson, who's an entrepreneur. And he said, most successful people are just a walking anxiety disorder harnessed for productivity. And I love that because I think that that's the case there, right? Like we all are underneath these pressures and these stressors. So Ike, I'm curious for you, you regularly are working with people that are within these leadership roles, be that management, executive leadership, C-suite level. And I'm curious, what have you found with the leaders that you work with? Is it often that they need to put their oxygen mask on first in order to have the ability to support the burnout that the rest of their teams may be experiencing? Is it simultaneous? What have you seen, and what are some strategies that you recommend for the leaders that you work with?
Yeah, it's a great question. I agree. Yes, I think leaders need to put their oxygen mask on first. I think a challenge is, a lot of times we don't think we have time really on this. And so in leaders I've worked with, it's like they want to, but it's almost like I already have so many other things to do. This needs to be on the back burner right now. And what I really challenge them to do is to think long term. In the short term, it feels like this thing you can push aside. But when you think in the long term, this is something that is something you have to focus on now. And when you think putting energy into yourself to focus on you first, then helping other people, it feels like it'll take forever. But what I've noticed is that it actually cuts down a lot of time. If you put time into yourself to really understand where you are and start to eliminate from your life, then you're able to help other people. And in the long run, you're able to see a lot more growth. And, some of the things that I talk about, I love talking about a growth culture. I think it's something to think about. I love thinking about having a growth culture versus a death culture. And I think what I've noticed that has been really helpful when people are thinking about burnout is really more of a growth culture. Like, how can I think about this in a growth minded way? How do I talk about this in a growth minded way? What does action look like? This is a culture, which is you spend your time thinking about all the shortcomings, or you're talking about things outside of your control. You're mainly staying stagnant. Those things are really birthed in more of a burnout culture versus having a growth mindset and saying, I'm going to think in a growth minded way when these things come. And so to be able to identify that, maybe I am thinking and talking and taking action in a more of a death culture way versus a growth culture. I'm thinking, talking, and taking action in a way that's going to help me get out of this.
Yeah. Can you give a specific example of a scenario where that might show up in using that? What might that look like in real time for someone?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I can also give a resource that can really help with this. And, I think I like keeping it simple because sometimes it's really subtle things. And when I say think growth, it may be a mentality of, I can't believe this happened to me. How am I going to get through this? Right? That simple thought can translate into conversations that we're having, where the conversation turns into, make you believe this happened, and you're talking about it. It's more of a not a progressive way that's going to help you move forward. And then it leads into complaining. So what I try to show people, a growth culture would be, okay, this happened to me. What's a way that I can actually move forward in a healthy way with this? Oh, I think it'd be a great idea. Why don't I run this idea by a friend? Hey, what if I tried this? I know we have a lot going on right now, but what if we tried this? Would that help? Yeah, that's great. Okay, I'm going to actually set a priority to take action on this. Two very different scenarios, very simple, but leads you in completely different directions. So people, if you have more of a deaf culture mentality, you're constantly putting yourself in this place where you're stagnant, not making an effort to make changes, versus simple things in a growth culture where you're able to say, I'm identifying that there's issues here. I'm not going to let it overtake me, but I can make incremental changes to start making progress.
That's great. Thank you so much for sharing that. Pat, how about you? How within the report that you all produced, what were some of those specific strategies that you all saw? And is there any that you would recommend to folks on the webinar today?
Sure. Which quadrant would you like me?
Let's do it within the eye care. I think thinking about this sort of individual piece and where, what would you encourage?
I think probably one of the biggest things is setting boundaries where you can. My other team members are huge on setting out of office reminders. At the end of the day, I am out of the office as of 5 o'clock. I will respond to your email tomorrow morning. Just letting people know, this is the time when I'm working, and otherwise I'm not engaged. Doing things like where you can, no meeting Mondays, or, no meeting Fridays, whatever habits you can put in place to really sort of preserve your space. Going back to what Ike said, just the work, it's just not sustainable.
Mm-hmm.
So doing things that allow you to take care of yourself, obviously, finding hobbies, things like that take yourself outside of work. For me, it's been fitness, huge on that. Just doing what you can to create more of a work-life balance.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think you mentioned in an earlier comment that when you're burned out because often your sort of self-care tends to slip in terms of what you do. So I know a lot of the studies and research that have come out about this often say like one of the best things that you can do is get some degree of exercise and make sure you're getting enough sleep as the first two very sort of basic things for this. And I think it resonates, I think, based on what you all are saying that we have to take that time away from work to have the space to be able to go back to it. You can't be just this constant hamster wheel that I think we often can feel like we're on. So some great strategies, some great recommendations here. Thinking about these kind of implications as it goes into sort of culture wide. I'm curious, Pat, within that sort of quadrant that you all looked at, were there other strategies that you saw or that you have seen within your work where, in terms of how teams can also be more supportive? I think the no meeting sort of agreement seems like a great start. Are there other things that you all have seen that really allow coworkers to support one another within these kind of efforts as well?
Mm-hmm. I have to say I'm a huge, huge, huge proponent of flexibility, whether that's location or hours. But just recognizing that, the workplaces are not one size fits all. People have different issues, different concerns, different responsibilities. And if you can provide that flexibility to allow for people to, again, have that work-life balance and take care of things outside of the workplace, I think that is definitely a big key. And it's not just as simple as being in the office or out of the office. I know that's there's a huge debate on that. But again, that flexibility where it's possible and giving people the option, allowing people to have voice in that. Some of the other things that we talk about are, and this was going back to what you talked about, fundraisers being unappreciated, nonprofit workers being unappreciated. I think it's very important to recognize. So often we get caught up in recognizing outcomes, recognizing dollars raised, the number of grants that were awarded, the number of people that were served. I think it's also important to recognize the effort that went into doing all of that. So not just that final, the final outcomes are important, but there's a lot of effort that goes into making all that happen. And sometimes you don't get the outcomes that you want. That doesn't necessarily negate the effort. So taking the time to recognize that, I think, is very important as well.
Yeah, on our team, we use Slack for all of our sort of internal communications, and one of our colleagues set up a channel that's the Yay channel, so that when something good happens or someone does something within a team, it's a really great, like, quick acknowledgement and nice way, I think, to shout out team members, show them they're appreciated, even if it's for something really small. Sometimes it doesn't have to be that you secured a $5 million gift. It can be that somebody was late to a meeting and you covered for them and they really appreciated that. And I think that's such a great point. Ike, how about you? What have you also seen related to that as well?
Yeah, this is going to sound interesting, but I think the more and more I work with people, I realize two things that I think are really helpful that more people need to do. One is time to actually reflect. Reflection, I feel like, is such a keystone habit when it comes to just your leadership, but also when you think about burnout, because a lot of the burnout we're starting to experience is in our mind. I mean, our mind is going 24/7. And so to be able to process your thoughts, taking 5 to 10 minutes a day to just reflect on the day, what's going on, how am I thinking through things, is a game changer. And so that one, but also this mix that I'm realizing people may not know as well, which is really prioritization, prioritizing your day. What does it look like to get things done? How often are you really distracted? are you defaulting to things that are easier and avoiding the hard things? I mean, these are things that we naturally do, but we don't necessarily talk about it much, but they are contributors to burnout. And so learning how to reflect and process your thoughts and how to prioritize your day well and know what you need to get done and how you need to get done and what are your biggest distractors can be such a big win to help you start to avoid the burnout you experience.
Yeah, that's great. And folks that are watching, if you have any good suggestions for things that you've tried and would recommend as well, please make sure to drop those in the comments. It's interesting, I think, kind of thinking about this reality of, within this kind of hybrid and largely remote workspace now, we are in meetings nonstop all the time. And I think, like, to your point, we often don't necessarily have a break between, right? When we used to be driving from meeting to meeting, you'd get a little bit of that commute time for the decompression. And that has gone away with the ease of being able to jump off of one meeting at 11:59 and onto your next at 12 p.m. I know a friend clued me into something that she started doing earlier in the pandemic when everybody was still entirely remote. That I theoretically try to do this, and in total honesty, it does not happen 80% of the time, but the 20% that it does, I always really appreciate that. For meetings that used to be an hour long, to schedule them for 50 minutes instead, and just using that last 10 minutes at the end for that period of reflection, just to allow any of those lingering thoughts coming off of that last meeting. Take your notes, write down whatever you need to do next to just sort of clear the decks a little bit. And that's been something I know has been a really great sort of thing that when I'm able to put that into place has been excellent.
Yeah, I have a friend who swears by that as well.
It's game changer. I need to make sure I do them all 100% of the time. So as we're thinking about it, we've talked a lot about some of these specifics. I think there's also something to be said for the fact that the widespread sort of reality of burnout within our organizations, within sort of just this kind of sector as a whole, I think we know that it really ends up having such an impact on our lives, our work, our mental health, all of these pieces. But I'm also curious, how do you all see that it ends up impacting the organization as a whole? I'm curious. Are there things that you've seen? Because I think sometimes it is the kind of old school approach of like, just work through it, get it done. It's going to be fine. You need to get over it, is something where I think it doesn't allow for the recognition of what happens when we allow this to become sort of the normal and don't address it within organizations, within companies, within a sector.
I think it manifests in several ways. I think, low morale, poor customer service, and that's both internal customers and external customers. In the ways that we treat each other, employees treat each other. And I think it goes into toxicity even. And I think probably those three are all kind of jumbled up together. It may be there sort of causes and symptoms all together. And then, of course, I think turnover. I think one of the statistics that we found in our research is that I think it was about 50% of the people surveyed had left a position because of burnout, or the factors associated with burnout. So, I think to me, it just speaks to it's just not sustainable. You just can't have, you just can't have people continuing to function in that space and expect that they're going to function well and that your organization is going to function well, because I just don't think it's going to happen.
Yeah, I agree with that, Pat. One of the thoughts I had was definitely high turnover. I mean, in conversations, that's something I see a lot. People are constantly, looking for something different. Like I mentioned before, a little bit of deaf culture. I mean, you start to see more of the complaining, more excuses, more negativity around it. And then something I've seen that's kind of interesting is a little bit more of like the performance over people. People starting to value the results more than they value people. It's like, we just have to get things done. We have to hurry up and move things forward, and then you lose track that these are actual people with lives who are working, and you just are just a performance engine.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it resonates for me too when we think about Pat, you mentioned like the customer service angle of this, right? And when we're a nonprofit, the kind of quote unquote customers are often the communities we're serving. And so how that shows up then becomes really, thinking about the ways that we're able to, as nonprofit professionals, what that ends up looking like in terms of the impact that we are or aren't having on the communities really resonates. So thank you for mentioning that. I also, as we sort of think about this and some larger kind of industry trends around this, one of the things that I know comes up very regularly in the reports on burnout is that it's a particularly acute as well in sectors where people help other people. So nonprofits obviously fall within this category, certainly medical professionals, teachers, that list goes on. But for purposes of our audiences that are likely here, nonprofits is a very major sort of sector within that categorization. And in particular, studies showed that it is even more present within women. BIPOC leaders and employees have an additional dimension of stress within their roles, of course, as we've seen. I'm curious, how have you maybe seen strategies show up or things that we should be mindful of that can be specific to individuals who may be in a position to experience more chronic and more acute burnout? And are there any things that we should be keeping in mind for those folks in particular?
So it's funny. I saw Adam Grant posted last week. He referred to it as a passion tax.
Yes.
And I don't know if you saw that.
Yes, I did. It was great.
Yeah. And basically, and I'll be more crass about it than he was, but organizations taking advantage of the fact that people love what they do. And I was thinking about and preparing for today, I think that nonprofits have what I would call a compassion tax. And so, in a lot of cases, people are expected to martyr themselves for the greater good. And organizations will take advantage of the fact that people care about the mission and they care about the people who are being served. And again, it's just not sustainable. And like you said, for women, for people of color, as a woman of color, I can attest microaggressions are very real, and they are very exhausting. And so it certainly makes a difference in how you show up in the workplace. And it certainly does tend to lend itself to greater levels of burnout. So how do you combat that? I think, doing your best, again, like I said, I'm a big proponent of flexibility, of work-life balance, and just, lobbying as best you can for that flexibility, setting the boundaries that you need to take care of yourself. Because I've always said, nobody's going to tell you you're working too hard. So you've got to take care of yourself as best you can.
Yeah. Ike, how about you within folks that you've coached over the years? Anything in particular that you recommend to those individuals that may be experiencing it more to a more extreme degree?
Yeah, this is really good. I mean, it's a heavier one because it can be overlooked. So thank you for this question. And sometimes this takes a little bit more digging to figure out the root of the problem. I'm just even given personal experience. I think about for me when I was in the nonprofit space, I realized a lot of my burnout and stress was somewhat self-inflicted. I don't think anyone, the environment was part of it, but self-inflicted because it's almost I thought I had something to prove. And I'm sure there are people who feel this way as well. And probably go even deeper, there was a lot of my worth that was in my work. And for anything, if more work felt like I was getting more worth. And to be able to separate that, I think is a big thing. And that's something I work on with clients a lot, of making sure that they see their value outside of what they're actually doing. Because that is a really good first step. Because once you see that, then you're able to do your work more and enjoy your work a lot more, opposed to, if something goes wrong in work, it means that something's wrong with you. And to disconnect that completely is really helpful and healthy. It'll allow you to live a better and healthier work-life flow.
Mm-hmm. Pat, within the frameworks that you all looked at, particularly within that sort of We Care framework in particular, I'm curious, was there anything that resonated for you that may be worth thinking about within this context, within sort of what, be it through an employee resource group, just within general colleagues that also may have this sort of communal experience?
I think it's all of that. With the We Care quadrant, we talk a lot about, like professional associations, finding your people. It's no coincidence that we're all members of the same Grant Professional Association. And a lot of times, we talk when new people come to the group or to GPA, they say, "Hey, I found my people." And that is so meaningful. I am also a big proponent of mentoring, and whether that's being a mentor or being mentored, but having that professional connection with someone outside of the workplace, but somebody that you can talk to, that you can bounce ideas off of, I think is also very important. So again, finding your people, finding your networks, people who understand where you're coming from and what you're going through, I think is just so important.
Yeah. Ike, anything else that you would want to add there?
I think that's great. I was thinking, one of the things in my head was just being mentored is a big one. I think naturally, especially in the nonprofit space, it's like we want to mentor. And so how do you really go out of your way to find someone who is willing to mentor you, and not waiting for it to come to you, but actually going to find it?
I wonder if there's also some value as well in, when we think about mentorship, when we think about professional organizations, I think it's that finding your people, but also seeing the shared experience that, a lot of these kind of symptoms of burnout that we have all experienced and have all seen present within coworkers and otherwise. How I wonder where having that be able to be reflected in someone that is also within your space, from a mentorship perspective, can really provide some of that one-on-one, like, yes, I'm seeing this happen. This is what I've done myself, or even just having that sort of shared kind of dialogue around it, where that can provide a little relief as well, just to know that it's not a isolating experience. So a thing that also comes to mind when we think about this, there's some things that we can control for within ourselves. There, some of these strategies that we've talked about, but there's also some things that we can't. And so I want to talk a little bit about what that looks like organizationally right now, both in the nonprofit sector, but also certainly industries at large. There are a lot of companies that are dealing with a shortage of employees. There's been at the beginning of the year, we saw so many corporations that went through massive layoffs, nonprofits as well. We know that this is a period where recruitment and retention is more difficult than ever. So when you're in the position of being within a company or an organization that is understaffed, and maybe understaffed for a durational period, that I can only, there is going to be the burnout that's going to occur from that, because like you said, nobody's ever going to tell you to work less or and particularly when you may be taking on the role, 2 or 3 roles beyond just your own, to help accommodate for some of that shortage. I'm curious, what advice would you give to somebody that's working on a team that may be experiencing that, and that it goes beyond sort of those immediately controllable factors? factors?
So great.
I think probably one of the biggest, I think will help is just communicate. Let people know that you're aware of the situation, that you're doing your best. If it's about hiring people, if it's about workload, that sort of thing, just keeping people in the loop, and letting them know that you're aware. Again, I think flexibility, I keep going back to that, but recognizing that where you can offer that. Again, it's a difficult situation because you don't have enough people. But just trying to recognize it again, you can't, the people that you've got, you can't work them to death. Again, because it's not sustainable. So I think just doing what you can, what is within your control to do to alleviate some of those stressors.
Yeah. Same question to you, and perhaps if you have any thoughts that based on things that you work with through with leadership in particular, on how they sort of manage for that as well, and strategies around managing for that for the team members that they're supporting as well, if possible.
It's good. One of the first things, I think about, talk about is really to play the long game. And I love asking, what's your vision? What's the vision of the organization? Because you want that to be an anchor, because especially in times where it's high stress, there's a lot of burnout, you can become very impulsive and things turn into more recency bias. Like you make decisions based upon what you're seeing right now. But when you can think a little bit longer term, you're able to see, oh, this is where we're going. So I think that's important. And I think sometimes the best support is honesty and vulnerability. From the team, sometimes it may feel that the leaders aren't experiencing at all, but leaders are sometimes, most times, experiencing the same thing. And that alone can be such a huge thing for a team member to know that they're not in it alone and they're experiencing that. And so I think that's another thing. And I think the last thing I'll probably bring up, that maybe it's more of a strategy, but I love working on this, but there's this whole picture of what is really urgent and important and what's maybe non-urgent important, and helping people discover that a little bit more. If everything's urgent and important, then nothing is. And usually in the space where burnout is occurring, everything is urgent and important. And so people are trying to do everything, and how to help them navigate that. And especially in the more nonprofit space, it's easier to say yes to everything with no pushback, and really learning what does it look like to be assigned something, but also to push back a little bit if it may not be that it needs to be worked on right now. I mean, there's a whole another conversation with that, but I think there has to be a point where no is a part of the equation. It's just yes all the time. Otherwise, a team member may put themselves in a position where they're asking for burnout.
Yeah. And, that makes me think, we work with a lot of organizations that have on interim sort of staffing, if they're in between a position, they're having trouble. And one of the things I know we talk about a lot is when we come into a role like that, what is that urgent item that actually has to keep happening, to keep the lights on, to keep the doors open, to continue a program that is mission critical? What are the things that, if once those kind of priority A items get done, then going to that next level of what are the things that if we are able to, we can start to look at, begin to do some things around. And then what are the things that just, while there is not a permanent person in place to deal with this has to be delayed until we're at a point where someone that's going to be here permanently can. And so I wonder too, if that can be an exercise as sort of a takeaway that, for leadership, it's really thinking about, particularly if you're in a situation where you are understaffed, under capacity for your team, doing that work first as the leadership, so to kind of take that burden off of employees that may not feel like they're in a position to turn down that work. I know, particularly I'd imagine within companies that are going through layoffs, things like that, employees probably are a little more on edge than normal and a little concerned about that. So you don't necessarily want to be the person declining that. But where kind of leadership maybe needs to take the first step in that organizationally, be that an executive director, a manager, whoever that may be, but the person that's sort of doing that delegation of tasks. Excellent. Let's go to some questions. We have just over 10 minutes left. I see we have a handful in the comments, and I'm going to raise a few that have come through. Our first here is, how can you be the starter of burnout conversations in a work environment that doesn't make it part of their culture? And what does that look like? Love this question, Natalia. Thank you.
Yeah. Again, I think it's being honest about what you're dealing with, and how you're viewing the situation, how you're feeling about it. And then offering solutions. So again, not just complaining, but here's the situation. Here's what I think would help. And everybody's not going to be receptive to that. And I think if you see that they're not, then I think that is where you then have to make some decisions. Because the thing is, you going forward as somebody dealing with burnout, if what is required is a culture change, you can't do that on your own. The organization, the leadership has got to be receptive to that. So I think, you have to have the conversation, and then you have to be realistic and honest about where the conversation is going and what your next steps are.
It's really good. This is one reason why I created a burnout assessment, because it's such an interesting conversation, because some people can get very offended by this, even if their pace is, maybe it's erratic or a lot's going on. They don't want to talk about burnout, and they don't want to be put in that category. So this is why I made an assessment, just to make it a little bit more palatable. And just, I even say, I took this assessment. Here's where I'm at. And just by me talking about it and my score, it allows them to discuss it more among their peers. And then the peers want to take it. And so the more you can make it a way of, or I'll just say, make it to where it's like, okay, I don't want to say burnout's okay, but hey, we all experience this to some degree. And so I love breaking it down into like a green zone, yellow zone, a red zone, because some people are moving and trending in that direction, but they're not there yet. But it's cool to know where you are. And I think if people saw it like that you don't have to wait till you're at the very edge and you're completely burned out. You can actually recognize signs now and start to shift things along the way.
I'm curious, are there, and this may not be something that we've seen in practice yet, but as you all think about some of these strategies we've talked about today, are there any policies that you would want to see an organization or a company adopt to better incorporate these strategies within their culture?
I think a lot of the strategies that we're seeing in terms of openness about mental health, and because I think that's tied into it as well. And so, recognize, I think organizations being willing to say that, okay, it's okay to not be okay, if you will. Forgive the cliche, but I think that's part of it. I think that's a good first step.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Ike, how about you? Anything that might be a good sort of policy level change that could happen?
Yeah, everything that I think about, it really relates to communication. I think the more open lines of communication, Pat talked about that earlier, is so big. And the thing that I notice as I work with teams or organizations is even talking to your boss about this is kind of abnormal. Some people are like, I just can't talk about this. And to normalize having conversations about this organization wide, it just, even casual conversations, or if you're in a one-on-one meeting, it doesn't have to just be work. You can actually bring up a topic like this. That alone can be huge. And of course, that needs to be modeled by the leadership, but just even open communication about topics, mental health and burnout, which is, connected to that in a lot of ways, could be really big.
Yeah. A couple of things that I know I have seen, and this is coming out of the for-profit sector. I think often in nonprofits, we're working from more of a sort of scarcity mindset a little bit, and so it doesn't feel like we have the ability to take some of that time. But a couple of things that I've seen that are really that we were interested in, and that at Purpose Possible we have to a degree looked at what would this look like to implement, and maybe worth considering too. I know. Bright House is a consulting firm that they do not, as a firm-wide mandate, they don't do meetings on Wednesday. That is a meeting-free day, and so it's not something that someone personally has to say, this is something that I personally don't do any meetings. I block my calendar. It is a company-wide decision that has been made, which I think also probably provides some freedom for somebody to really take that. Another is there are multiple companies I know too that have started adopting a model of picking a week in the year where the entire company closes. And it is a couple of our partners that we work with do this, where the entire company at large, it's not restricted to specific teams or otherwise, are able to fully shut off their emails, to shut down. They don't have to do anything. And it's really intended as a mental health week. In other organizations, we've seen it where sometimes that's used as more of a reading week. Somebody can use that time to work on a longer term project or research project that they've been doing, but just that they have a little bit of time that's less of that daily grind and more of an opportunity to step away and give some breathing room to their work.
I would just add, and I may be stepping on Ike's toes here, but I think it really is important for leaders to model quote unquote anti-burnout behavior, if you will, because I think that then sets the stage, and people understand, okay, hey, this is a healthy environment. This person cares about making sure that we're not burned out. I think that's very meanpful.
Yep. Yeah, I saw
two more to add. Sorry,
as you're
saying that. Half Day Fridays was a really good one that I've seen, and then also I think this one, people were like, "How is this possible?" But no meetings after 5. No, I'm sorry, no emails after 5. So that's something that I've seen where I'm like, okay, that's a bold one, but to really help protect the culture and not move into burnout.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks for those. All right, we have another question from the audience. How can you tactfully tell someone that you're afraid that they are on the road to burnout and you're concerned about them? Because I know we see it all the time, so I'm curious to hear what you all think.
I don't know. I tend to be a more straightforward person. I think it's just, sitting that person down and having a conversation, maybe sharing resources about burnout, and the impact of it, what it means, what can happen. Doing it. I mean, and obviously it sounds like this person is, talking about somebody that they care about. And just not wanting to see that person, fall. I think it's just, again, tactfully, respectfully, just starting the conversation and sharing resources.
Yeah, I agree with that in conversation. I mean, I'm probably less straightforward and I want to help them get to there. But I really focus on 2 areas. I bring up the sustainability of their pace, and where I recognize it will be like, you don't have a sustainable pace right now, or you're demotivated by the work you're doing. And so I want to be able to ask questions to help see if that's them. And I think there's some cool indicators that will even show that. And I love asking questions like, do you feel like you're losing sleep over work a little bit more? Do you feel like everything will fall apart if you take your foot off the gas? Do Do you like you're more negative than positive at work? And just try to ask questions to feel that out. And as they start answering that, if it's mainly yes, then I'll say you're probably leaning towards this direction. And I want to help give you resources so that you can help get out of this.
That's great. Thank you all so much. This has been so insightful, and I hope has left everyone with some fantastic strategies that they can put into place themselves or can hopefully take back to their organizations. If you have any additional questions, we will share the contact information for Pat, Ike, and myself. Please feel free to reach out afterwards. We'll also be sending out a follow-up email to everyone who is registered today with the resources we cited, along with other useful resources and links on burnout. If you didn't register, please just drop your email in the comments and we'll make sure to get that to you. And if you haven't already, a shameless plug to please sign up for the Purpose Possible newsletter so we can let you know about other webinars like these, as well as other useful resources every month. Pat, I thank you so much for your time today. We so appreciate all of your insights and we're so grateful to you for being here. And thanks to everyone else for coming and watching today.
Absolutely.
Thank you.